He hadn't touched another soul in 417 days. No voices, no visitors, no reason to open the door. Until tonight. Until a child barefoot, breathless, banged on his truck window in the storm and said, "She's not breathing." Caleb Dawson had once built towers that scraped the sky, signed checks that moved nations, and sat in boardrooms where silence meant power. But none of that mattered anymore, not since Emma died. He now lived in a small, weather-beaten cabin on the edge of Pine Hollow, where the trees whispered more than the people did. His days passed in quiet rituals, chopping wood he didn't need, brewing coffee he never drank, and setting the same extra plate at the table he never touched. The photo of a laughing girl stayed on the mantel, untouched by dust, as if her smile could still hold the roof above him. He didn't speak much, not because he didn't have words, but because the ones that mattered had died with her. So when he saw a woman huddled inside the town's abandoned bus stop with 3 small children wrapped in damp blankets, he told himself to keep driving. He almost did. But the smallest girl looked up. Her eyes didn't beg, they recognized him. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt seen. The cabin sat on the edge of Pine Hollow like an old secret too tired to hide, weather-worn and quiet. It blended into the trees that whispered through every gust of wind. Inside, Caleb Dawson moved through his morning like a man performing rituals for a god he no longer believed in. He lit the fire before dawn, even though it was warm outside. He brewed 2 cups of coffee, always 2, but only drank 1. The other sat across the table, cooling beside an empty chair that hadn't been touched in almost a year. He never moved it. Never dared. Above the mantel, the photo of a little girl, brown curls, gap-toothed smile, eyes bright enough to shame the sun, watched him with frozen joy. Emma. His daughter, his whole world, gone. People in town said he'd changed after the accident, that he stopped showing up to meetings, stopped returning calls, stopped being the man who once ran half the state's real estate from a tower with his name on it. But Caleb didn't care what they said. They hadn't held Emma's body as it cooled. They hadn't heard the last words she ever spoke, "Daddy. Are you mad at me?" They hadn't failed to answer in time. Since then, the silence had become his only language. He chopped wood not because he needed to, but because the rhythm reminded him of her heartbeat steady, until it wasn't. He walked the same forest trail every evening, not for exercise, but to feel the world turning without him. He'd grown comfortable with the ache, with the loneliness. It asked nothing from him, demanded no healing, offered no false hope, just silence. That morning, like every morning, he opened the front door at 6:00 Sharp, mug in hand, eyes cast toward the empty road beyond the trees. He didn't know what he was looking for. Maybe a ghost, maybe forgiveness. But the road gave him nothing. Just mist, just wind, just the promise of another day exactly like the one before. And Caleb was fine with that. Or so he told himself. The cabin creaked with every shift of wind, as if it, too, remembered what had been lost. Cold in a way that went beyond temperature. The wooden walls held a stillness that no fire could soften. Dust clung stubbornly to untouched surfaces, except for one corner where small toys lay arranged in silent defiance of time. A stuffed rabbit, its fur matted from years of being clutched in tiny hands, sat propped against a faded dollhouse with a missing door. Beside it, a row of mismatched figurines formed a crooked parade across the floor, exactly the way she had left them. Caleb hadn't moved a thing. He couldn't. In the living room, a single wooden chair remained tucked at the far end of the long dining table. It was smaller than the others, a custom build from years ago, just the right height for a child who insisted on eating like a grown-up. The seat still bore faint crayon markings beneath the varnish. A secret Emma had whispered to him like a joke, "I'm signing my spot so nobody else can steal it." Caleb had laughed then. He hadn't laughed since. Every day. He walked past that chair but never touched it. Every evening. He set the table with one fork, one spoon, one plate, and a second place across from his, always untouched. The silence around that spot was louder than any conversation. The light from the fireplace barely reached the edges of the room, leaving shadows to linger in corners like unspoken grief. A small pink backpack, now faded and limp, still hung from the coat hook near the door. He had meant to pack it away after the funeral. He never did. It stood as both a monument and a wound. Even the air felt different inside the cabin, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Caleb sometimes wondered if the house would collapse the moment he tried to change anything. So he left it all: the dollhouse, the chair, the backpack, the empty coffee cup. This was the museum of a life that ended too soon, and he was its only visitor. Every morning, just after lighting the fire and brewing the coffee, Caleb Dawson would walk toward the old oak table with slow, deliberate steps. In his hand, always, was a small photograph, edges frayed, corners curled, the colors softened by time and touch. It was no bigger than his palm, yet he held it with the kind of care reserved for fragile things. In the picture, Emma was mid-laugh, her face slightly blurred from movement, one dimple deeper than the other, arms raised like she was about to fly. He never framed it. Frames made things final, and nothing about her felt finished. Instead, he kept the photo loose, tucked into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, close to where his heart used to beat normally. As the scent of coffee filled the cabin, he would circle the table once, sometimes twice, staring at the chair she once claimed as hers, the little one with crayon scars still etched beneath the seat. He'd pause there, photo in hand, as if waiting for something invisible to give him permission to sit. But he never did. Sitting felt like acceptance, and Caleb had never accepted her absence. So he remained standing, fingers tightening around the photograph, eyes fixed on the place where she should have been. The chair always seemed to look back at him, defiant in its stillness. On some days, his legs would tremble, not from age or exertion, but from the weight of memory. He'd lean slightly forward, almost lowering himself onto the bench, but then he'd stop, swallow hard, turn away, a ritual of restraint. Instead, he'd place the photograph gently in the center of the table, beside the untouched coffee cup, like a silent offering. No words were spoken. None were needed. The photo said everything: joy, loss, guilt, love. Sometimes, he'd whisper her name so softly even the walls didn't hear. Then he'd retrieve the photo, tuck it back into his shirt, and return to the window to watch the road that never brought anyone. Each day began like this, not with hope, not with healing, but with the act of remembering, because forgetting, to Caleb Dawson, would be the final betrayal. The empty chair stood at the far end of the table like a wound carved into wood. It wasn't just furniture to Caleb Dawson, it was memory solidified, a monument to what he had lost and could never reclaim. Crafted from pine and stained a soft, honey brown, it was the only chair in the cabin built with smaller arms and a lower seat, custom made for the child who once insisted on being big enough to sit at the grown-up table. Emma had picked the paint herself. Caleb remembered how she dabbed a finger in the stain and smudged it beneath her nose, giggling as if she'd become part of the wood. That stain remained, faint and ghost-like, just beneath the seat. No matter how many times he cleaned it, it never disappeared. And he never tried too hard, because that smudge was hers. The chair hadn't moved since the day she left for school and never came back. Caleb didn't push it in, didn't tuck it neatly under the table. It sat slightly askew, turned just enough to suggest someone had been sitting there and had only just stepped away. That positioning mattered more to him than sleep, food, or time. It was his anchor, his reckoning. A symbol that no matter how much the world spun forward, grief had drawn a line in the wood and said, "Here, this far, no further." Every time he passed it, which was often, his chest tightened like a fist was closing around his lungs. And yet, he could not look away. He would pause, sometimes hover his hand above the backrest, fingers trembling, aching to make contact, but he never let himself. To touch it was to risk breaking the only remaining tether he had to her. The chair bore no dust. He cleaned around it carefully, never sitting, never altering its position. Visitors on the rare occasions they came knew better than to mention it. Caleb wouldn't allow them to sit there, wouldn't even allow them to acknowledge it, because to him, the chair wasn't empty. It was occupied by silence, by memory, by the echo of a little girl's laughter. And in the vast quiet of the cabin, it was the loudest thing of all. Ellie Warren had not meant to end up in Pine Hollow. It was a dot on the map she hadn't even noticed until the engine gave out just past mile marker 212, smoke curling into the freezing October air as her children slept huddled in the back seat. She'd coasted into town on fumes and prayer, pulled into the gravel lot behind the shuttered post office, and made a silent promise to stay only one night. That had been 4 nights ago. Now, with no gas, no money, and no one to call, the bus stop shelter near the edge of town had become their home. It offered little protection from the cold, just 3 plexiglass walls and a warped metal bench, but it was better than nothing. She laid down her worn coat each night to shield the children from the wind, curling her body around them like a second layer of protection. Lily, her oldest at 12, never complained, though Ellie could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders curled inward, already carrying more weight than a child should. Mia, 7, had developed a soft, persistent cough, worsened by the damp nights and thinner air. She clung to her stuffed bear with one hand and to Ellie with the other, never letting go even in sleep. Noah, only 5, had gone quiet after the first night. He didn't speak much to begin with, but now he didn't even hum or whisper. He simply stared, big eyes tracking every movement, every noise, as if trying to memorize the world in case it disappeared again. Ellie tried to keep their spirits up. She told bedtime stories through chattering teeth and hummed lullabies even as her lips trembled from the cold. She foraged in the town's back alleys for scraps, scavenged canned goods from an old vending machine near the abandoned train station, and accepted small kindnesses from strangers too curious to turn away. But Pine Hollow was not a forgiving place, and the stairs were growing colder by the day. She tried to shield the kids from it, from the pity, the suspicion, the way people whispered runaway or junkie when they thought she couldn't hear. What they didn't know was that Ellie had once had a life, a job, a husband, a front porch with potted plants and dinner on the stove. But that was before everything crumbled. Now, she only had her children. And even though her pride was bruised, her bones aching, and her hope threadbare, Ellie would have slept standing if it meant keeping them warm. The old bus stop sat forgotten at the edge of Pine Hollow, half swallowed by the surrounding forest and cloaked in the kind of damp silence that only deep woods can hold. Rain had been falling for hours long, slanted sheets of cold that beat against the warped plexiglass panels and dripped steadily from the rusted overhang. The ground had turned to mud, thick and clinging, and puddles pooled at the corners of the shelter where the foundation had cracked. Inside, Ellie Warren pressed her 3 children closer together, wrapping her thin coat around all of them like a threadbare shield. She sat on the metal bench, her back aching, her legs numb, her heart thudding with a quiet panic she dared not let them see. Lily, the eldest, sat upright on one side, arms wrapped tightly around Mia and Noah, both curled into her as if she were the only warmth left in the world. Ellie ran her hands over their damp hair, whispering that everything would be okay, even though the words felt like paper in a storm flimsy, dissolving on contact. Her fingers were stiff with cold, and her jeans were soaked to the knee, clinging to her skin like ice. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and unmoving, save for the rhythmic sway of pine trees battered by the wind. With each gust, the shelter groaned slightly, as if the bones of the structure were protesting the weight of another night spent holding up a life that didn't belong there. Ellie tried to block the gaps in the wall with cardboard, but the wind always found its way in. She could feel the water creeping into her shoes, seeping through the sole she'd taped twice already. Mia shivered, then whimpered, and Ellie cradled her tighter, trying to transfer her own body heat even though she had none left to give. Lily didn't speak, but her eyes flicked constantly between the shadows outside and her siblings' faces, the way only a child forced to grow up too fast could. Noah pressed his cheek to Ellie's side, silent and still, his small hands clutching the hem of her shirt like an anchor. In that moment, Ellie felt the crushing weight of failure. But she also felt something else, a thread of defiance, raw and aching, buried beneath the exhaustion. She would not let this shelter become their home. She would not let the rain win. Somewhere out there had to be a way forward. But for now, she could only hold them tighter and pray the dawn would come. Caleb Dawson hadn't planned on taking the old forest road that evening, but the main route into town was washed out from the storm, and he needed to deliver a load of firewood before nightfall. The back of his pickup was stacked high with fresh-cut logs, the scent of pine thick and sharp in the damp air. He drove slowly, wipers slapping against the windshield as rain blurred the world into a gray, trembling haze. His focus was fixed ahead, jaw clenched, thoughts drifting like they always did toward the empty chair at his table and the photo in his pocket. He passed the rundown bus stop without thinking just a half-second glance, the way one looks at an abandoned thing long forgotten by the world. But something caught, a flicker of motion, or maybe something quieter, more human. He didn't slow down at first, but in that fleeting instant, through the rain-streaked glass of the shelter, his eyes locked with a pair of smaller ones wide, brown, afraid, and shining with fever. It was the middle child, a girl no older than 7, Mia. Though Caleb didn't know her name yet, she didn't cry, didn't wave, didn't even move. But her eyes held his with a kind of desperate stillness that unsettled him. Not loud, not begging, just pleading without sound. Caleb's hands tightened on the wheel. His foot hesitated on the gas. But he kept driving. The road curved, trees bending in the wind, shadows swallowing the edge of the path. His cabin was less than 3 miles ahead. The firewood delivery only another mile past that. He told himself it wasn't his business. People came through Pine Hollow all the time, passing ghosts with stories not meant for him. But even as he told himself to forget, his grip shifted. That look, that quiet, piercing look, gnawed at something beneath his ribs. He didn't see the mother, not clearly. Just the shape of a woman hunched over, arms wrapped tight around 2 smaller forms. And the way the girl had stared like she was asking a question he didn't want to answer. Caleb made it another 1/4 mile before the silence inside the cab became unbearable. The rain hammered down harder, but it was the memory of her eyes that cut through the noise. He pressed the brakes slowly, staring at the empty road ahead. His breath fogged the glass. He didn't turn around, not yet, but he didn't keep driving either. Ellie didn't trust the knock on the plexiglass. Not at first. Not even when it came again. Softer this time. Followed by the shape of a man standing outside in the rain with his hands visible and empty. She had pulled the children behind her like a shield, her heart pounding loud enough she feared they could hear it. Caleb Dawson didn't say much, just that he had extra wood, some dry blankets, and hot soup if they wanted. But Ellie's eyes narrowed instantly, her voice low and sharp as she told him no. Not thank you. Not maybe later. Just no. She had learned the hard way that kindness often came with strings, a neighbor offering a ride, only to lock the doors and drive past her stop, a landlord waiving rent, then showing up drunk at night, a social worker with a warm voice and cold clipboard who promised help but left her children crying in a fluorescent waiting room. No. She had no room left for hope that came from strangers. She could survive the cold, survive the hunger, but she would not survive the look in her children's eyes if one more promise turned to betrayal. Caleb didn't push. He simply nodded and stepped back, but Ellie watched him like a cornered animal, unsure whether to run or fight. She hated the way Lily looked at him curious, too open, hated more the flicker of longing in Mia's expression, or the way Noah glanced up from his silent world just long enough to track the man's boots in the mud. "Don't look at him," Ellie whispered, not cruel but pleading. "We're fine." But they weren't. She could see Lily biting her tongue, holding back questions, could feel Mia trembling again despite the blankets. Still, Ellie wrapped her arms around them tighter, as if love alone could ward off pneumonia and disappointment. Caleb had left a box just outside the shelter before walking away. No words. No pressure. Ellie stared at it like it was a trap, then turned her back to it. Pride and fear held hands in her chest, both louder than the wind. She didn't know who Caleb Dawson was, but she knew one thing for sure. No one helped for free. Not in her world. Not anymore. The rain hadn't stopped, not for hours, and the cold had turned sharper, biting into Ellie's bones as the night deepened. She sat huddled in the corner of the shelter with the children pressed against her sides, trying to keep their bodies close enough to share what little warmth remained. Her coat was soaked through, her skin raw beneath it, and her mind a storm of fear and stubborn resolve. She had ignored the box of firewood left by the man Caleb. He had said, though she hadn't asked. She had told herself it was a trick, that taking anything from a stranger would be the beginning of losing everything she still had: her children, her control, her dignity. But then Lily shifted beside her, subtle but deliberate, and leaned in close enough that Ellie could feel her breath against her ear. Her voice was barely audible beneath the wind. "Mom," she whispered. "Mia's burning up." Ellie froze. Her pulse quickened, but her body went still, every instinct colliding at once. She pulled Mia closer and pressed her hand to the girl's forehead. It was damp not just from the rain, but from sweat, heat radiating through layers of soaked clothing. Mia's breathing was shallow, her cheeks flushed with something that had nothing to do with cold. Fever. Ellie's chest clenched so tightly it hurt. For a moment she said nothing, just held the little girl tighter, trying to will the heat away. But it was no use. Denial wouldn't cool a fever, and pride wouldn't save her daughter's lungs if pneumonia had already taken hold. She looked over at Noah, asleep but restless, and then to Lily, whose wide, frightened eyes bore into her like quiet accusations. Ellie wanted to scream, to run, to vanish into the woods with them and disappear from every choice she didn't want to make. But all she could do was pull Mia into her lap and rock her gently as the rain drummed louder on the plexiglass roof. Then, with a breath that felt like defeat, she stood. She opened the door of the shelter, stepped out into the storm, and looked in the direction Caleb had gone. "Wait," she whispered into the night. "Please wait." She didn't care if he heard. She only cared that someone did. The cabin smelled of pine and smoke when Caleb pushed open the door and led them inside. He didn't speak much, not out of coldness, but because he knew words were fragile things, easily mistrusted and often misunderstood. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose, as if every gesture had already been rehearsed. He placed a large log on the fire, stirring the embers until they flared alive and filled the room with a warm orange glow that stretched across the wooden floor. Ellie stood near the doorway, drenched and trembling, still clutching Mia in her arms. The other two children hovered close, their eyes wide and scanning every corner of the unfamiliar space. Caleb didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for names, explanations, or promises. He simply pulled 4 thick blankets from the cedar chest near the hearth and spread them carefully across the worn rug in front of the fire, one for each of them. He folded the corners down the way someone would when setting a place at the table, like this moment was something prepared for, not improvised. Then he fetched a small wooden stool from the kitchen corner, the kind a child might use to reach a counter, and placed it gently in the center of the room. It wasn't clear what the stool was meant for: a seat, a footrest, a boundary marker, but its presence made the room feel less like a stranger's house and more like a quiet invitation. The flames crackled, throwing shifting light across the walls and catching on the glint of framed photographs, long turned face down. Caleb said nothing, only glanced once at Ellie, who hadn't moved. Her eyes were wary, lips pressed into a line too exhausted for gratitude, too alert for surrender. She hesitated before stepping in fully, her soaked shoes leaving tracks across the floor. Lily helped Mia out of her wet coat, while Caleb disappeared briefly into a back room and returned with a folded towel, placing it beside them without a word. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was cautious, deliberate, the silence of people who have been burned and now measure everything by temperature. Yet something softened, barely, as Ellie knelt to wrap Mia in one of the blankets. For the first time since the shelter, her hands stopped trembling. The fire cracked again, steady this time. Caleb didn't sit, didn't press. He just stood near the doorway, rain still dripping from his jacket, as if guarding them from whatever came next. It started the next morning. Caleb had risen early, like always, lighting the fire before the frost could creep too far into the floorboards. The cabin, though warmer than the rain-soaked shelter, still carried the echo of quiet tension. Ellie stayed near the hearth with Lily and Mia, whispering instructions and helping Mia sip broth from a chipped mug. But Noah had vanished. It wasn't until Caleb returned from the woodpile, boots dusted with frost, that he noticed the shift. Ellie didn't seem alarmed, just tired. But her glance toward the table said enough. Caleb followed her eyes and saw the smallest edge of a blanket sticking out beneath the thick wooden bench that lined one side of the cabin's long dining table. When he stepped forward, Noah's head dipped further behind the table leg, a ghost retreating into shadow. The boy didn't cry. He didn't speak. He didn't even flinch. He just folded himself smaller, as if he could disappear into the cracks of the old oak floor. Every time Caleb entered the room, it happened again. If Noah had been playing with his sisters or curled in Ellie's lap, he'd slip away like mist as soon as the front door creaked open. No outburst, no explanation, just a quiet, automatic retreat to the same hiding place under the table, crouched behind one of the heavy wooden legs like a soldier who had long ago stopped believing rescue would come. Caleb never tried to force him out. He noticed the way Ellie's shoulders stiffened every time she saw him glance toward the boy, and so he kept his distance. He spoke softly when near, avoided sudden movements, and never stepped past the invisible threshold Noah had drawn with his fear. Once, when bringing soup for the others, he slid a small bowl toward the edge of the table and placed a napkin on the floor nearby, not saying for whom it was, but not needing to. Later, the napkin was gone. The bowl was empty. It was a truce, of sorts. Still, Caleb felt the weight of those small, silent eyes watching him from beneath the table. He didn't know what had made the boy so afraid, what man, what moment, What memory had built this instinct into his bones, but he recognized it, not in detail, but in kind. There had been a time when Caleb too had hidden from the world, not under furniture, but inside silence. He didn't know how to fix this, didn't even know if it could be fixed. But each time Noah disappeared beneath the table, Caleb left the door open just a little longer, just in case someday the boy might step out first. Mia had always drawn things she couldn't quite say, feelings too big, questions too heavy, memories too tangled to untie with words. While Ellie kept close to the fire and Lily helped with simple chores around the cabin, Mia found a corner near the window where the light spilled in warm and quiet, far from the hush of adult conversation and Noah's silences beneath the table. Caleb had handed her a box of old colored pencils he found in a drawer, worn down to soft nubs, the kind his daughter once used before the world shifted. He hadn't meant it as an offering. Not really. But when Mia's eyes lit up and she murmured a quiet thank you, he realized how long it had been since color had lived in this cabin. Mia didn't ask for paper. She found scraps backs of invoices, an old calendar torn into squares, even the faded cardboard from a cereal box. On the third day, as the snow began to flirt with the edges of Pine Hollow, she drew something different. It wasn't just flowers or clouds or the stars she often imagined. It was a table long and wooden, with thick legs and curved edges, unmistakably modeled after the one in Caleb's kitchen. Around it, she drew figures her mother with dark, sweeping hair, Lily with her watchful eyes and always bent elbows, Noah tucked beneath the bench but peeking out, this time with a tiny smile, and herself, seated proudly with her arms outstretched, as if caught mid-laugh. And at the head of the table, she drew Caleb not entirely detailed, just enough of the beard, the broad shoulders, the way his eyes looked like tired parentheses when he smiled. But there was something else too. At the far end, opposite Caleb, she had drawn an empty chair, not blank, not forgotten. The outline was there, carefully sketched, with the suggestion of a figure faintly present but never filled in. When Ellie asked her who it was, Mia only shrugged. "That's the chair where the sad feeling sits," she said softly. "But it's okay. We saved a place for it." Caleb didn't speak when he saw it. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, the fire behind him casting flickers across the drawing. And for the first time in many months, he didn't feel the weight of the silence pressing in. Somehow, in crayon and cardboard, Mia had drawn not just the people at the table but the space grief left behind, and the strange beauty of not pushing it away. The dining table, once a hollow monument to absence, had slowly begun to shift. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden bursts of joy or declarations of belonging. It happened in whispers. Mia's giggle when Lily made her rabbit-shaped toast, the clink of mismatched spoons stirring oatmeal, the rustle of Noah's feet brushing against the wooden floor as he crept out from beneath the bench just far enough to feel the fire's warmth. Each day, the children grew a little louder, a little braver, as if the cabin itself were remembering how to breathe. Ellie remained cautious, her voice measured, her gaze always checking the door, the windows, the distance between her and the world outside. But even she began to soften. She helped cook now, showed Lily how to slice apples with care, laughed once quietly when Mia spilled flour and insisted the white puff on her nose made her look like a snow fox. And yet, despite all this gentle blooming, Caleb never sat. He hovered. He refilled cups, fetched kindling, mended a loose plank beneath the bench. But when the others gathered around the table, he kept his distance. He stood near the stove, mug in hand, pretending to sip. He leaned against the windowsill, eyes focused on the woods beyond, listening but never joining. The chair at the end, his chair remained empty, Not by accident, but by choice. It wasn't that he felt unwelcome. The children never excluded him. In fact, Mia once patted the seat beside her and said plainly, "You can sit here if you want." But he had only smiled, murmured something about stiff knees, and walked away. That chair had once belonged to someone else too, someone with a lopsided braid and a laugh that filled every knot and groove of the old wood. To sit there now felt like betrayal, like letting go of something he wasn't ready to release. And so the table lived in two realities, one present, alive with children's laughter, the other haunted, held together by silence and memory. Caleb contributed in his way. He fixed, fetched, protected, but the boundary remained. He watched them find joy in the simplest things: shared pancakes, a clumsy hand-drawn game of tic-tac-toe, the way Lily braided Mia's hair with twigs like forest crowns. He watched and listened, and let them fill the air he once kept still. The table, for the first time in years, had life again, but the seat that once held his heart remained empty, and Caleb wasn't sure yet if it ever could be filled again, not because there wasn't room, but because some griefs don't like to be interrupted. It happened one night after the children had fallen asleep, their soft breathing filling the cabin with a rare kind of peace. The fire crackled low, casting shadows that danced across the wooden beams overhead. Ellie was seated near the hearth, arms wrapped around her knees, her body tired but alert, as if rest was something she hadn't trusted in years. Caleb stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered trees that glistened beneath the moonlight, his silhouette carved sharp against the glass. For a long time, there was only silence between them, not tense, not cold, just the kind that sits comfortably between two people who've seen too much. Then, without turning, Caleb spoke. Her name was Emma. His voice was steady, but beneath it ran something fractured, something worn thin. Ellie didn't move, but her breath hitched almost imperceptibly. He continued, eyes still fixed on the dark horizon. She would have been 8 this year. Same age as Mia, almost. Smart kid. Brave. She used to drag this stuffed fox around by the tail, left it everywhere. Even in the soup pot once. Drove me crazy. There was the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. Gone as soon as it appeared. She got sick fast. One minute it was a cough. Then it was everything. I thought I had time. I thought I could fix it. But I waited too long to bring her in. I kept thinking I'd be strong enough on my own, that she'd bounce back like always. But I was wrong. And by the time I reached the hospital, his voice broke off. The silence after it was heavier than any words. Ellie stared into the fire, her eyes glassed with something she didn't let fall. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You stayed here because of her." Caleb nodded slowly. "I left everything else, my job, my friends, the people who told me to move on. But I couldn't leave this place. Not when I was the reason she didn't make it. Not when the last thing she saw was this house." Ellie looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since she arrived. She saw not just the man who opened his door in the storm, not the quiet presence fixing floorboards or warming soup, but a father wrapped in penance, trying to turn every day of silence into a language of apology. And in that moment, she understood Caleb wasn't waiting for life to return. He was living each day as atonement, hoping that somewhere in the quiet, Emma might forgive him. Ellie didn't speak right away after Caleb's confession, but something in her posture shifted, less guarded, less clenched, as if the wall she had built so carefully over the years had finally begun to crack. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the lines beneath her eyes, the ones that hadn't been carved by age, but by worry. nights without sleep, and the relentless ache of carrying 3 children through a world that didn't want to make room for them. She stared into the flames for a long time, as if drawing strength from the flicker, then finally said, "There was a time I thought if I disappeared, no one would notice. No one would come looking. I was just background noise to most people. A girl with too many bags under her eyes and kids clinging to her coat." Her voice didn't shake, but it was heavy with the weight of memory. Back then, I stayed quiet because quiet people survive longer. I stopped asking for help because the only thing worse than being turned away was being pitied. I told myself I didn't matter, that the best I could do was stay alive long enough for my kids to grow old enough to stop needing me. She let out a hollow laugh. Not bitter, just tired. But they proved me wrong. Every time Lily wraps her arms around me like I'm something worth holding, every time Mia leaves me one of her strange little drawings under my pillow with stick figures that all have my hair, every time Noah God, even when he's scared, scoots closer to me in his sleep. They don't let me forget I exist, even on the days I want to. Her eyes turned to Caleb then, soft but sharp, like someone seeing not just the man, but the emptiness he carried. They tether me to this world, Caleb, not because I'm perfect, not because I'm strong, just because I'm theirs, and they keep choosing me even when I don't think I deserve it. She exhaled slowly, the words freeing something in her chest. So, I stay, because they see something in me I've never seen in myself. She looked back at the fire and added, barely audible, and maybe that's enough to try again, in that moment, between 2 people who thought they had nothing left to give, something past an unspoken recognition that pain doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it clears just enough space to start over. It started the morning after the snow softened just enough to let sunlight drip through the pine trees like melted gold. Caleb had already been up for hours, stacking firewood, checking the roof for ice dams, shoveling a narrow path to the shed. He didn't expect anyone to be awake yet, not with the cabin finally warm enough for deep sleep. But as he approached the chopping block with an armful of logs, he noticed Lily standing nearby, coat zipped to her chin, eyes steady. She didn't speak, just nodded toward the axe like it was something sacred. For a moment, Caleb hesitated. It wasn't fear not of her getting hurt, not exactly. It was the weight of knowing that trust, once extended, couldn't be taken back. Teaching a child to split wood wasn't just a chore, it was an offering, a kind of unspoken pact between teacher and learner, protector, and the one becoming strong enough to protect. He studied her 12 years old, thin but wiry, quiet but watchful. She had the same sharp focus Emma once did when she tried to master something beyond her size. Without a word, he set a log on the block, placed the axe handle in Lily's hands, and knelt beside her. "Grip it like this," he said, his voice low, steady, but gentler than it had been in months. "It's not about strength, it's about balance. Let the axe do the work." Lily nodded, absorbing every word. Her fingers curled around the worn wood, tentative but eager. He guided her stance, corrected her elbows, then stepped back just enough to give her space while still close enough to catch the axe if needed. Her first swing was off. It struck the side of the log and glanced away, but Caleb didn't wince. He simply reset the log and said, "Try again. You've got time." By the 4th attempt, the axe sank in with a satisfying crack, and Lily's eyes lit up not with pride, but with something softer, more reverent. She looked at Caleb like she'd been handed a secret, and in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just that Caleb trusted her with the axe. It was that she trusted him to teach her, and he trusted himself not to fail her. It was small, almost invisible to the world. But for Caleb Dawson, letting a child swing an axe beside him was the first step toward letting someone into the broken rhythm of his life. A life that, for the first time in years, no longer felt entirely his to bear alone. It began with a quiet cough, the kind no mother likes to hear but tries to dismiss because the world has demanded too much already. Mia had been more tired than usual that morning. Her little body curled into Ellie's side like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. At first, Ellie thought it was just the cold air or maybe a restless night, but by noon, Mia's forehead was burning, her breath shallow and quick. She tried cool cloths, whispered lullabies, pressed kisses into damp hair as if her love alone could smother the fever. But by dusk, the child began to tremble. It wasn't just shaking, it was violent, uncontrollable, her eyes fluttering and teeth clenched as her small frame convulsed in Ellie's arms. Panic, old and sharp, flooded Ellie's chest like a broken dam. She shouted for Caleb, her voice cracking the silence of the cabin like glass against stone. He rushed in, took one look at Mia, and without hesitation moved to build a makeshift bed closer to the fire, his hands calm, his voice firm. But Ellie pulled away. "No," she said, her voice brittle. "We shouldn't have stayed. This was a mistake." Caleb froze, not at her words, but at the fear in her eyes, not fear for Mia, but fear of what staying meant. Ellie clutched Mia tighter, pressing her daughter's face into her coat, her body rocking with guilt and instinct colliding like thunder. We get attached, and then we lose again. That's how it happens. Her eyes were wild, almost feral with grief not yet named. If I stay, and she dies here, I'll never forgive myself. I should have kept moving. I should have. But the words broke. All the resolve, all the hard-earned walls built from years of survival began to crack under the weight of a little girl's burning skin and the kindness of a man who had never asked her to be anyone other than broken and tired. Caleb didn't speak. He simply walked over, placed a thick blanket on the floor beside the fire, and said, "You're not alone anymore." His voice wasn't commanding. It was quiet. Sure, the kind of voice that could hold up a storm. Ellie sank to her knees, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. Mia whimpered in her arms, and Ellie whispered, "Please stay, baby, stay." It was the first time she prayed in years, not to be saved, but to stop running. The storm outside had settled into a cold silence, but inside the cabin, the air felt like it was splintering. Ellie had packed the essentials in less than 5 minutes: blankets, cough syrup, a nearly empty jar of peanut butter, and had Mia bundled against her chest, still warm and fragile from the fever, but breathing more evenly now. Lily and Noah stood by the wall, wide-eyed and wordless, their expressions a blend of confusion and fear, as if they were watching something sacred unravel. Caleb stood in front of the door, boots planted like stone, arms trembling not from cold but from something deeper, older, and far more volatile. Ellie avoided his eyes, her voice clipped and final. "We'll find a place. Don't worry. I'm not your problem." But when she reached for the doorknob, Caleb stepped in front of it and raised his voice for the first time since she had known him. "No," he said, sharp enough to cut through the air. "You're not doing this." Ellie flinched, startled not by anger but by hurt. "Move, Caleb." He didn't. His breath came heavy, his chest rising and falling like something caged too long, and then, like a rupture years in the making, his voice cracked through the wood and silence. "I am not losing another goddamn chair at that table." His words thundered across the room, shaking something loose in the walls, in her, in him. "I already sit across from one that's empty every single night. I already hear one less laugh. I already tuck one memory into a photo frame I can't touch. I will not." He swallowed, his voice breaking. I will not add 3 more to that silence. I won't survive it. Ellie froze, her hand still on the doorknob, her heart pounding in time with his pain. He wasn't shouting at her. He was shouting at ghosts, at grief, at the cruel arithmetic of love and loss that had already stolen too much from both of them. And in that moment, her own armor built from shelters, betrayals, courtrooms, and cold park benches cracked just enough to let the truth in. Caleb Dawson, who rarely spoke above a whisper, had begged her to stay not out of pity, but out of the raw, broken hope that maybe, just maybe, the table didn't have to echo anymore. Ellie stood there, frozen, her hand still clenched around the strap of her bag, the sound of Caleb's voice reverberating in her chest long after the words themselves had faded. It wasn't just the volume that undid her, it was the truth. The kind of truth that peeled through defenses built from years of holding too much alone. She looked down at Mia in her arms, then at Lily and Noah, standing like little statues with 2 big eyes that had seen too much too soon. Her breath hitched as her knees buckled, the strength she had borrowed from desperation finally draining away. She crumpled slowly to the floor, not from weakness but from the unbearable weight of finally being allowed to break. The silence that followed was not awkward or cold. It was sacred, like the hush of a chapel just before a confession. Caleb didn't rush to her, didn't say some heroic line or offer pity wrapped in platitudes. He simply lowered himself to the wooden floor beside her, close enough to offer presence but far enough to let her choose. Ellie cried with her whole body, silent sobs giving way to gasps she didn't know she'd been holding for years. Grief for the girl she used to be, fear for the mother she was now, and a deep, aching exhaustion from always being the one who kept going no matter the cost. Caleb sat quietly, elbows resting on his knees, gaze steady on the fireplace, not trying to fix her, only staying. That night, the cabin didn't feel like a place of ghosts, but like shelter, a quiet, tender kind of shelter. One by one, the children settled. Lily curled beside the fire with her hand resting lightly on Mia's shoulder. Noah, who once hid beneath tables like shadows might swallow him, crawled into the blanket Caleb had laid out days before and sighed a full-bodied sigh that sounded like the release of something long held. And for the first time since arriving, all 3 children slept without flinching in their dreams, without fists curled in fear. Ellie leaned her head back against the wall, her tears slowing but not stopping, and whispered a single hoarse word that no one but the walls and Caleb heard. Thank you. He nodded once, quietly, and stayed beside her. Not because he had answers, but because he knew how much it meant when someone finally didn't leave. The morning after the storm broke not with thunder or sorrow, but with the soft sound of pancakes sizzling on a skillet and the faint laughter of children echoing off the cabin walls. Something had shifted. It was small, almost invisible, like the way light starts to fill a room before the sun fully rises. Caleb stood at the kitchen counter flipping batter with a focus that bordered on reverence, while Ellie brushed Mia's damp hair, her touch gentler than before, no longer rushed by survival. After breakfast, Caleb quietly said, "We're going into town." His voice steady but softer now, like he wasn't just talking to them, he was including them. Ellie blinked, surprised, and the children perked up. "What for?" she asked, cautious. Caleb glanced at the wooden table, the one with the empty seat that had been haunting him for years. "We need a new table," he said simply. "A bigger one." The drive down into Pine Hollow was quiet, but not tense. Lily pressed her forehead to the window, tracing foggy swirls with her finger. Noah hummed under his breath in the back seat, and Mia, still pale but alert, clutched a worn stuffed rabbit as if it were made of gold. Caleb didn't say much, but his hand rested firmly on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set not with distance, but purpose. At the woodworking shop, a little place run by a man named Joe who'd known Caleb since childhood. The group stepped into the warm scent of cedar and pine. Caleb walked through the rows of handcrafted tables until he stopped at one that wasn't perfect. There was a slight knot in the grain and a groove where someone had clearly run their fingers too deep, but it was long, wide, and strong. "This one," he said. Ellie stared at him. "You sure?" Caleb nodded. "It has room." The children each touched the surface as if blessing it, and Joe, without asking questions, offered to deliver it that afternoon. Back at the cabin, Caleb moved the old table to the shed himself. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. When the new table arrived, it filled the room differently. It didn't erase what was lost, it just made space for what was now possible. That night, 5 plates sat evenly spaced, 5 chairs were pulled out, and Caleb, for the first time in years, sat down among them, not as a host, not as a stranger, but as part of something that was slowly, quietly becoming a family. Later that afternoon, with the new wooden table standing solid and unadorned in the heart of the cabin, Caleb did something no one expected, least of all himself. He stood back, arms crossed loosely, and looked at the children gathered curiously nearby. "It's yours too," he said, his voice gruff but without sharpness, more like someone brushing dust off old words. "We should make it feel like home." The kids exchanged glances, unsure at first. Then he turned to Lily, the oldest, the one who had watched the world with careful, wary eyes since the moment they met. "You pick the color," he said simply. Her eyes widened. "You mean paint?" He nodded. "For the legs and edges. Whatever you want." She hesitated, scanning his face as if waiting for the catch. Then whispered, "Ocean blue." Caleb raised a brow. "That's a color." Lily grinned for the first time he'd seen. "I'll show you." Next, he knelt down to Mia's height and held up a swatch book Ellie had found in the old cupboard, filled with fabric samples from years ago. "You like drawing, right?" he asked. Mia nodded shyly. "Pick one," he said. "Whichever you want for the tablecloth." Her little fingers moved slowly across the samples, hovering over the fancy lace, the bold patterns, until she settled on a soft yellow one with tiny wildflowers. "It's like the field outside," she murmured, and Caleb smiled. Barely, but enough. Then came Noah, the quietest, the one who still ducked behind Ellie's legs when doors opened too fast. Caleb didn't ask him for words, he simply pulled out the chairs one by one, nodding toward each until Noah reached out and tapped the third from the left. Caleb gently pushed it in and said, "That one's yours." It wasn't just about painting a table or laying down a cloth. It was about saying this space is yours now, not borrowed, not temporary, not conditional. Ellie stood back watching all of it, arms folded, lips trembling into a smile that was half disbelief, half awe. For the first time in her life, someone had handed her children not just safety, but belonging. Later, as Caleb painted the legs ocean blue while Lily held the brush steady and Mia draped the yellow cloth over the top, Noah climbed into his chosen seat, kicked his feet against the floor, and said nothing at all but the way he rested his head against the wood spoke volumes. That table, once a symbol of grief, was becoming something new, not to replace the past, but to welcome the future. The sun had nearly set when the last stroke of paint dried, the scent of ocean blue mingling with wood smoke and warm bread. The cabin, once silent as a tomb, now breathed with quiet signs of life blankets folded at the edge of the couch, dishes stacked neatly beside the sink, a pair of small shoes by the door. Caleb stood near the window, arms resting on the sill, watching twilight settle over Pine Hollow, and for a moment he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the ghosts that used to fill the empty spaces were starting to loosen their grip. Behind him, Ellie moved quietly through the room, adjusting the new tablecloth that Mia had chosen, her fingers smoothing over the yellow wildflowers as if memorizing them. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching again, her pencil darting across the paper with a confidence that had only recently begun to surface. Mia lay curled up in the rocking chair, thumb in her mouth, her eyelids heavy with sleep. And then there was Noah. He had wandered quietly toward the table after dinner, his steps careful, as if testing the ground beneath him. He walked around it once, paused, then walked around it again. Caleb turned slightly, watching from the edge of the room, but didn't move or speak. He'd learned by now that Noah needed space, like others needed air. The boy reached the third chair from the left, the one he had chosen earlier, and stood in front of it for a long moment. His small hand brushed the top of the backrest. Then he pulled the chair out slowly, climbed in, and sat with his legs dangling, not quite reaching the floor. Everyone else had stopped moving. Even the fire seemed to hush. And then Noah looked up, his dark eyes meeting Caleb's just briefly before shifting to Ellie, then back to the table, in a voice barely above a whisper, raw from disuse but clear as bell chime in silence. He said, "This is my seat." The room didn't erupt with noise. No one clapped or cried. But Ellie gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, and Caleb's fingers clenched against the window frame as something deep inside him broke and reformed all at once. Noah's words weren't just about a chair, they were a declaration, a quiet but monumental claim that he belonged here, that this space was his, that this home, however fragile, however new, was now part of him. And in that stillness, something sacred passed between them, not spoken but understood. No more empty chairs. Late that night, while the children lay sound asleep beneath the quilted covers and the cabin exhaled its familiar breath of wood and warmth, Ellie sat at the small desk tucked in the farthest corner of the living room. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the pen, the same one Lily had used to draw flowers on the back of an envelope days before, and stared down at the sheet of paper in front of her. It had taken her hours to find the courage, perhaps even longer, to admit what needed to be done. The lamp cast a soft glow, and the shadows of the new table flickered across the walls. But Ellie didn't look toward it. She couldn't. Not tonight. She began to write. Caleb. The letter started, plain and unadorned, like everything between them. I never wanted to be someone you had to fix. I know what it cost you to open that door, to let us in, to see something in 3 strangers that maybe reminded you too much of who you lost. That night, when Mia got sick, when you yelled not to leave another chair empty, I understood, more than I let on. You've lost so much already. You've carried that pain alone because you thought you deserved it. And maybe, in your mind, helping us was a way to do something right again. Maybe we helped you too for a little while, but the truth is, I never wanted to stay, not because of you, because of me. I've lived too long waiting for the next goodbye, for the next door to close. I know what happens when people start to feel like home. You lose them, or worse, you make them hurt. I don't want to be another weight around your neck, another soul you're trying to keep from drowning. I don't want you to feel responsible for holding us together. We were broken before we got here, and I'm afraid of what it means to be whole again. That's the truth. So I'm leaving before it's too late, before the kids forget how to sleep in the rain, before I forget how to be alone. Thank you for the firewood, the soup, the quiet, the kindness. And thank you for showing me that people like you still exist. But this is not your burden to carry. You don't have to heal everyone. Caleb, sometimes people leave, and it's not your fault. She signed it simply, folded the paper in half, and placed it on the newly painted table, tucked beneath Noah's drawing of a sun with 5 figures around it. Then she slipped back into the shadows, heart breaking with every step. When the morning light crept softly through the windows, casting gentle gold across the wooden floor, Caleb stood silently in the kitchen, a worn photograph trembling between his fingers. He had found her letter hours earlier, tucked beneath Noah's crayon drawing on the table that had only recently begun to feel like the heart of something alive again. He hadn't cried when he read it, not at first. Instead, he sat still, absorbing every word, letting them sink into the hollow places inside him where pain and memory once coiled like smoke. But now, as the house held its breath in the quiet aftermath, he knew what he had to do. His boots echoed softly against the floorboards as he crossed the room, each step deliberate. He moved to the center of the table and set down the photograph. Emma, 5 years old, her front teeth missing, her eyes crinkled in mid-laugh as she held up a frog like a treasure. It was the only picture he ever kept out, the one that traveled with him from room to room like a heartbeat. Beneath it, on the back of a small note card, he wrote 7 simple words in the rough, determined hand of a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything still worth offering, not to heal, just to live forward. He didn't write her name. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't plead or explain or try to fix anything. He simply left it there. On the table they had all begun to gather around, between the bowls of dried pine cones Mia had arranged, and the folded napkins Lily insisted they reuse. A message not of guilt, but of choice. A bridge without pressure. Caleb stepped back, glanced around the room that had changed without him even realizing, less cold, more lived in. The worn boots by the door weren't just his now. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, Ellie's tea, or maybe just the presence of people who had stayed long enough to make a dent in the silence. He knew he couldn't make her come back, but he also knew this sometimes. People didn't need saving. They just needed someone to walk beside them in the aftermath, to say, "Me too," to sit at the same table and not try to erase what was lost, but to believe something else could still grow around it. He placed a second chair beside the photo, just in case. Then he waited. The woods behind Caleb's cabin weren't marked on any map, but he knew every bend in the trail, every moss-covered stump, every place silence hung heavier than snow. Months ago, maybe longer. He had stopped counting. He walked that trail with nothing but a rope in his pack and a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. It was late, cold, and quiet enough that he could hear the bones in his knees crack with every step. He reached the old hunting tree near the creek, the one Emma used to call the Watcher because its branches spread wide like arms open to the sky. He tied the rope with slow, practiced hands, not because he was brave, but because he was done. Not angry, not even sad, just done. And then, a noise he hadn't expected, a giggle, sharp, small, real. At first, he thought it was memory tricking him again, the way grief sometimes let Emma's voice echo through the trees. But then he heard it again, closer this time. He looked down and saw her. Not Emma, but the little girl from the bus stop, Mia. She stood a few yards away, soaked, clinging to a tree trunk with bare feet and wide eyes. She didn't say a word, just stared like she had at his truck window days later. But this was before that. She was out there alone, watching him, unknowingly saving him. She tilted her head the way children do when they're trying to understand something too big for them. And Caleb couldn't do it, not with her eyes on him. He untied the rope, slowly, like someone waking from a trance. She never asked what he was doing. She never ran. She just turned and disappeared into the trees like she belonged to the forest. He didn't know then that her name was Mia, didn't know she'd be sitting in his cabin weeks later with damp socks and a sketchbook full of strange, beautiful worlds. He only knew that for a moment. Someone had seen him not as a ghost of a father, not as a man hollowed out by loss, but as a person still standing. That night, she saved him without knowing. And now, every time he looked at her across the table, he carried that moment in his chest like a second heartbeat. It was never about being rescued. It was about being seen. The cabin still bore scars from the past, the scorched edge of the old curtain rod in the kitchen, the smoke-stained beams above the fireplace where Caleb once hung Emma's handmade paper stars, but that night, the windows pulsed with warmth instead of silence. And for the first time in years, the place smelled not of old wood and solitude, but garlic, cinnamon, and something like hope. Ellie stood at the counter, stirring a massive pot of chili while Mia carefully arranged cornbread on a mismatched tray. Lily folded napkins with the precision of someone trying to make things beautiful. And Noah, with his tiny fists full of crayons, scribbled little signs that read, "Welcome," and "Everyone eats." Caleb had never planned on hosting a dinner for strangers, let alone turning the only home he'd known into a beacon for people like the ones he used to avoid eye contact with downtown. But something had shifted the day Ellie decided not to run, and the day Mia's fever broke, and the day Lily asked, out of nowhere, "Do you think anyone else is cold tonight?" That question had sat in Caleb's gut for days, until he finally said, "Then let's make dinner for them." No grand speeches, no flyers, just word of mouth through the gas station clerk, the librarian, the man who slept in his truck near the lumberyard. By sundown, a slow stream of worn boots and tired eyes began showing up on Caleb's porch. Some brought Tupperware. Some brought nothing. None were turned away. Ellie opened the door to each one like she was inviting them into her own heart. And Caleb, apron awkwardly tied around his flannel shirt, ladled out bowl after bowl without once thinking about who they used to be. The old life, the grief, the guilt, the rope in the woods, it all burned away in the face of this quiet revolution of warmth. Chairs scraped, spoons clinked, children laughed too loud, and for the first time, the old table held more than ghosts. It held community. It held redemption. It held life. Caleb looked around that crowded room and saw not just guests, but echoes of who he used to be and who he could still become. Family, he realized, wasn't just who you lost. It was who you made room for. And in Pine Hollow, on a chilly night filled with firelight and second chances, a new family was born over bowls of chili and stories no one had dared tell in years. They didn't talk much about the number. It simply happened, quiet and instinctive, as if something sacred had woven itself into their preparations. 12 chairs. 5 were obvious, one for Caleb, one for Ellie, and one for each of the children, Lily, Mia, and little Noah, who now insisted on his spot near the window. But the other 7, they weren't labeled or assigned. They were placed with intention, spaced just enough to say you're welcome here without saying anything at all. Caleb dragged the old chairs out from the shed, still coated with dust and spiderwebs, and sanded them gently until the wood looked almost warm again. Ellie stitched small squares of cloth to cover the worn seats, each a different color, none of them matching, because life wasn't meant to match perfectly. It was meant to belong. Lily helped align them in 2 careful rows, and when she stood back and counted out loud, 5 plus 7, Caleb froze in the doorway with a nail in his mouth and nodded, because yes, 12 felt right. They could have placed 6, or 10, or however many fit, but 12 held weight. It held possibility. The number echoed something bigger than all of them, something like hope, like readiness, like faith in the unseen. The first night they sat down, Mia asked, "Who's going to sit in the other chairs?" And Ellie simply said, "Whoever needs to." And strangely, they came. One by one. A boy with no gloves who ate quietly and left a drawing under his bowl. A woman who brought apples from a forgotten orchard. An old man who hadn't spoken in years but cried when Mia handed him a cookie. The 7 chairs weren't always filled, but they were never truly empty. Sometimes they held coats, sometimes bags, sometimes just the warmth of knowing someone could be there. And in time, those chairs became more than furniture. They became promise, a symbol that space would always be made, even for the broken, even for the late. Caleb had once lived in fear of a single empty chair. Now, he lived for 7 of them waiting, hoping, ready, because love didn't close the table. It opened it wider. And in a world that too often locked its doors and rationed its kindness, 12 chairs in a small cabin in Pine Hollow whispered to anyone passing by, "You belong. Sit. Eat. Stay." The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees when Lily found the small scrap of weathered wood leaning against the cabin wall, half buried in pine needles and dirt. It wasn't anything special, just an old, forgotten board, likely once part of a fence or crate, but something about its rough surface and soft grain caught her attention. She wiped it clean with the sleeve of her hoodie, revealing a warm, golden tone beneath the years of dust and rot. Caleb noticed her at work and paused in the doorway, one eyebrow raised, but he didn't ask. He just watched. Lily rummaged through the drawer where Ellie kept mismatched crayons, then took the black one, dull and cracked from age, and pressed it carefully to the wood. Her tongue peeked out in focus as she etched the letters slowly, like they carried the weight of every night they'd slept in safety, every morning that started with laughter instead of fear. The wood soaked in the crayon like ink on parchment. "DAWSON," she whispered, then paused before the first word. Her fingers hesitated. Then, in careful strokes, she added the word home, but something made her stop. She stared for a long second, then rubbed it gently away. Too vague, too distant, and then, with a breath so steady it almost didn't sound like a child's, she printed the words, "The Dawson House." There was no ceremony, no applause, just the quiet sound of her placing the finished sign beside the porch steps, angled so anyone coming up the path would see it. Noah came running by and asked, "What's that?" Lily just smiled. "It's ours now. Inside." Ellie was slicing apples for pie, and Caleb was fixing the hinge on the front door. Neither of them saw her do it. But that night, when he stepped outside to bring in the firewood, Caleb paused at the steps, eyes falling to the board. He didn't speak. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he bent down, lifted the small sign, and nailed it gently to the post beside the door, just beneath the lantern. And there it stayed rough, uneven, written in crayon, but truer than any nameplate money could buy. Because that was the moment it became real. Not just a place where people stayed, but a home. The Dawson house. Not his. Not hers, theirs. The evening light spilled in soft amber waves across the kitchen as Ellie dried her hands on a towel worn thin by years of someone else's use, the scent of cinnamon and old pine lingering in the air. Caleb was mending the leg of a chair Lily had claimed as her own. Its wobble had gone from annoyance to affection in the weeks since they'd found shelter beneath his roof. The kids were outside chasing fireflies, their laughter floating in like smoke through the open windows, and for a moment, the world was impossibly quiet in its peace. Ellie leaned against the counter, watching Caleb without speaking. There was something in his silence she had come to trust, not because it demanded anything, but because it held everything. And then, in that hush where the night first meets itself, she asked, barely louder than a whisper, "What if one day I fall apart?" Caleb looked up slowly, not startled, not confused, just still. She didn't mean physically. She meant that quiet collapse the way a soul folds under weight no one else sees. What if I can't do it anymore? What if I get too tired, too scared, and just stop? Her voice caught on that last word, like it didn't want to be let out. What happens to them? Then, to you, to this? Caleb didn't answer right away. He placed the chair down gently, ran a calloused hand across the smooth wood, then crossed the kitchen until he stood in front of her, his eyes holding 1,000 broken mornings and rebuilt nights. "Then I carry you," he said. No hesitation, no poetry, just fact. "Not because you need saving," he added, softer now, "but because that's what you do when someone's part of your table. You carry them until they can stand again." Ellie blinked fast, trying to push the heat from her eyes, but one tear betrayed her, slipping down her cheek. "And if I fall more than once," she asked, half smiling, half aching. Caleb leaned in, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "Then I'll carry you every damn time," he said, with a voice that sounded like old wood and stubborn hope. "We don't count the falls here, just the getting back up. Outside." Lily called out that the fireflies were dancing higher tonight, and Ellie breathed in as if she'd been underwater for years. For the first time in a long time, the idea of falling didn't scare her, not because she believed she wouldn't, but because now, finally, she knew she wouldn't fall alone. Ellie stood by the doorway, her silhouette bathed in the soft golden glow of the porch light as the children's laughter dwindled into the quiet hum of crickets and rustling leaves. Her arms were folded tightly, not out of defiance but to hold herself together, and Caleb watched her from across the room, sensing the weight she hadn't voiced yet pressing against the walls of her chest. She wasn't crying not tonight, but the stillness in her eyes told him everything. It wasn't fear of storms or sorrow that haunted her now. It was the fear of letting someone hold her, the fear of needing, the fear of staying. She turned to him slowly, her voice just above a breath, fragile and unfinished. "I don't know if I can be what you need," she whispered. "I'm not strong like you think. Some mornings I wake up and the world feels too loud. I snap at the kids for nothing. I get scared for no reason. And the worst part is, I hide it, because I think if I let it show, if I let it break through, I'll lose everything we've built here. You'll look at me and wish you'd never opened that door." Caleb didn't speak right away. He walked over, every step steady, quiet, like he was approaching a wounded animal and didn't want it to run. When he stood in front of her, he didn't reach out. Didn't touch her, not yet. He simply looked into her eyes with a kind of gentle ferocity, the kind that could shatter walls without lifting a hand. "Ellie," he said, his voice a slow river, deep and deliberate. "I don't need you to be strong." She blinked, startled by how easily the words landed. "I never did," he continued. "I've seen strength, and I've seen pretending. What you carry, how you keep going for them, how you showed up here with nothing but still made space for love. That's not weakness. That's living. And if there are days when you fall apart, then fall. I'll be here. I don't need you to carry everything. I don't need you to smile when it hurts. I just need you to stay." Ellie's lips parted slightly, not to speak, but to breathe in what she had never been told before, that her worth was not in her resilience, but in her presence. "Stay," Caleb said again, softer this time, like a prayer, "not because you're strong, just because you're you. And you're here. That's all I've ever needed." She leaned into his chest then, not collapsing but surrendering, not giving up but giving in to being seen, to being held, to finally belonging without earning it. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting a gentle amber glow across the room as the evening deepened into a comforting silence. Caleb sat on the floor beside the couch, his back resting against the edge, arms draped loosely over his knees, while Ellie nestled nearby, half asleep with her head tilted onto his shoulder. Lily had long since drifted off, curled up beneath a wool blanket with her sketch pad still open, a pencil slipping from her hand. Mia had fallen asleep mid-sentence, her hand still clutched in Ellie's, and Noah quiet, observant. Noah sat a little apart from the others, his small frame barely filling the armchair that had once belonged to Emma. Caleb hadn't said much all night, but everything had changed. The house no longer echoed with absence. The empty chair had been replaced by voices, the stillness filled with breath and belonging. There was a warmth that had not touched this place in years, not since before grief hollowed it out. Caleb looked around, absorbing it all, the colored drawings pinned to the walls, the worn kitchen table now cluttered with mismatched mugs and cookie crumbs, the lingering scent of cinnamon and pine. It wasn't grand, but it was full of life, of second chances, of something dangerously close to hope. And then Noah shifted. He slid off the chair slowly and padded across the room with the uncertain steps of someone still learning what it meant to be safe. He stood before Caleb and looked at him not just with his eyes, but with the deep, unblinking gaze of a child who sees everything. Caleb sat up, unsure what to say, what to do. But Noah didn't need anything more. He stepped closer, leaned in, and whispered a single word so soft it barely touched the air. Dad. The word struck like lightning through still water, silent but shattering. Caleb froze, his breath caught halfway between disbelief and something too sacred for speech. Noah wrapped his thin arms around Caleb's neck with a quiet certainty, and Caleb, overwhelmed, closed his eyes as tears welled and spilled without resistance. He held the boy gently but fiercely, arms trembling, heart wide open. It wasn't the word itself that undid him. It was what it meant that despite the silence, despite the sorrow, despite the years of carrying ghosts and guilt and grief, someone had chosen him not for what he'd built, not for what he'd lost, but simply for who he had become by choosing to stay in life. It's easy to believe that healing comes from fixing something ourselves, others, the past. But sometimes, the most powerful form of healing comes not from grand solutions, but from quiet presence. Caleb didn't bring Ellie and the children into his life with promises or perfection. He didn't try to erase their pain. He simply stayed, again and again. He showed up with an extra blanket, an open chair, a steady voice in the storm, and that was enough. Because often, what we need most isn't someone who can make everything better. It's someone who won't leave when everything feels broken. The lesson here is simple yet profound. You don't have to be strong all the time to be loved. You don't have to have all the answers to be part of someone's life. And you don't have to erase your pain before you're worthy of connection. Sometimes, love is as simple as saying, "I'm here." If you've ever felt like you had nothing left to give, like you weren't enough, or like you were carrying more pain than anyone could possibly understand, remember this story. Remember that your presence is powerful. That being there, even in silence, can mean the world to someone. And that healing doesn't always arrive with noise. It often enters on quiet feet and sits beside you at the table. If this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of someone you love, someone you lost, or the kind of family you dream of building, let us know in the comments. Save this video if you want to come back to it on a hard day. And if you believe in stories that show the beauty of second chances and the strength of quiet love, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Your story matters too, and we'd love to hear it.